Welcome to Life Interlinked. Today, we're talking about bee decline. The number of pollinator species around the world has decreased over the past 50 years, and the United States and Europe have seen losses in their most well-known pollinator, the honeybee. And many wild bees share the same problems as honeybees. But a single cause is unlikely. Diseases and human activities are just two factors of increased pollinator loss. But have bees gone through anything similar to what is happening now? Michael Engel of the University of Kansas studies the evolution of solitary bees and other insects. Engel's team of researchers discovered a 14-million-year-old fossil of a honeybee in Stewart Valley, Nevada. The discovery surprised Engel. Scientists thought the European honeybee was the only honeybee to exist in North America. The species of honeybee found in the U.S. is Apis mellifera. European settlers brought it over in the 1600s.
For a long while, it was perceived, since the time of the earliest record of honeybees going back 30 million years or so, that honeybees were strictly old world, that they never once made an incursion into the new world. What this fossil showed was, that in fact they had, at one point in the past, quite a long time ago, made a path into North America. There was a species that did get here and then eventually went extinct.
That species was Apis nearctica.
And so honeybees joined the ranks of some other rather famous organisms, horses perhaps being the most famous, the Chinese tree of heaven, Ailanthus being another famous example, whereby these lineages that we think of that diversified in the old world had made it to North America during the colonial era.
About 20,000 bee species exist around the world, and they did not always pollinate flowers.
If you just take sort of a gross perspective, have bees always been pollinators? Yes. They evolved from a group of largely predatory wasps. So about 125 million years ago, there was a transition among one lineage of these predatory wasps to a vegetarian, if you will, lifestyle. The reality is we call this group bees, but bees are effectively highly specialized vegetarian wasps.
And honeybees showed up around 30 million years ago.
So they're relative newcomers, whereas many of these lineages extend back, 100 million years or so.
Bees adapted with different groups of plants that evolved.
They range anywhere from generalists, like some of the sweat bees, which will visit pretty much any flower that they are capable of getting pollen from, to more specialized groups that are specialist pollinators for only select families or genera of plants, and they've got a much more intimate, almost one-to-one relationship.
The orchid bee is a famous example of species adapting for each other's benefit. The bucket orchid has evolved special chambers that allow the male orchid bees to pick up their pollen.
And the male's there to collect oils that the orchid is producing, and as he's gone through these chambers that the orchid has in order to comb up and collect these oils, the orchid places a pack of pollen on his back, which he then transmits to the next orchid as he goes about collecting these fragrances.
The male orchid bee uses these scented oils to attract females. And Engel says wild solitary bees carry out most of the pollination that takes place in different ecosystems.
They wield a massive ecological impact in terms of the pollination services that they undertake.
How important is understanding the evolution of bees in the context of bee decline? Bees are sort of facing many difficulties now environmentally. So with a better understanding of how they have evolved over time, how can we better understand how they're being affected throughout bee decline?
You can learn a lot about what may be going on in the future by looking at past historical trends. By looking back to the fossil record of insects, for example, one of the things that we can see is that climate is a major player in terms of shaping insect distributions, causing them to contract, causing them to expand, leading to localized areas of extinction, or in the worst case scenario, global extinction.
Engel says the pace of climate change today has had a similar effect. Insect pollinators have lessened in areas where they once thrived and grown in areas where they were few. Even the seasonal blooming time of flowers has changed.
There was a colleague of mine who is a botanist and is looking at floral timing and how the timing of certain flower species is shifting as a result of the climate.
And researchers at the University of East Anglia in England found something similar. Their research showed how the early spider orchid and the miner bee have become more out of sync as spring temperatures rose over the past 150 years. And one climate shift in the past caused a major extinction event for many bee species.
There was a period of time about 35 million years ago called the Eocene-Oligocene transition. It was the last period during which we had a global greenhouse. And then during this transition, our planet cooled dramatically and became much drier.
The world's climate became closer to what people in the US and Europe experience today.
Prior to that, in the Eocene and older periods, you still had subtropical temperate environments at the poles. So Antarctica was forested. One of the great examples is high in the Canadian Arctic on the island of Axel Heiberg. There were still populations of crocodiles living. It was a very different world.
The transition caused different social bee species to die out.
Relatives of honeybees, bumblebees, and stingless bees, which are dominant social bee lineages today, don't have common names because they've never survived to the present day to get common names. But there was this wonderful diversity of other social bees that were out there.
Ingalls says scientists have collected fossilized pollen that showed their relationship with plants in the Eocene epoch. But most social bee species went away after the transition.
They were wonderful pollinators. We just have to hope that either we can curtail a bit the shift that's going on now, or that today's bee lineages were somehow able to make the shift that their relatives were unable to do.
Honeybees face many challenges because of climate change and other stressors, but they are not going extinct. Beekeepers can recover their colony losses by reintroducing new queens from healthy hives into surviving ones. But one problem with honeybees showed up in the winter of 2006 and 7, and it got beekeepers pretty scared. That's coming up in part 2. Stick around. American beekeepers started noticing something strange about their colonies during the winter of 2006 and 7. Mark Dykes is a research assistant at the University of Maryland's Van Engelsdorp Bee Lab. Dykes described it as if the bees abandoned their hive.
A hive of bees that has a queen left behind, but the majority of the workers have left, and the stores, the honey and the nectar, and the pollen are still there.
The Environmental Protection Agency says beekeepers reported losing 30 to 90% of their colonies during that winter, and half of the hives had the same symptoms as what Dykes described. Scientists called it colony collapse disorder. With most of the worker bees gone, the colonies fell apart, and similar cases go back to the 1860s. Explanations range from viruses to nutrition, but Dykes says,
we were never able to pinpoint whether it was a viral issue, whether it was bacteria, nutrition. There has been a tremendous amount of research that has gone into beekeeping since then, but none of it has been able to directly identify the cause of colony collapse disorder.
And reports of CCD have dropped since its peak.
There's kind of a misconception now that all colony loss is attributed to CCD. That's actually not true. We haven't really seen CCD for about the past 5 or 6 years. It's thankfully not the main issue with bees right now.
The more pressing issues with bees include pesticides and poor nutrition. And the biggest threat honeybees face are varroa mites.
That's a parasitic mite that feeds off of both the larva and the adult bees. It weakens the bees, but it's also a vector for viruses. You combine that with poor nutrition and exposure to pesticides, and you have a pretty good multifactorial issue that absolutely weakens the bees and can cause death and decline in the hives.
The mites showed up in the U.S. during the 1980s. They entered through Florida from South America. Why CCD happened in the first place is a mystery. but Dyke says another episode of the disease seems unlikely.
Given the losses that incur because of bromites and other things, we're used to kind of dealing with losses in the industry. Obviously, we would prefer to get those loss rates that sometimes can get up to 40+% per year. We'd like to get that lower.
Beekeepers aim for a 15% loss rate, but the current losses go beyond that goal, and the possible reasons for both wild and managed bee losses are complicated. Stay tuned for part 3. One-third of the food humans eat comes from plants bees pollinate. Humans would not starve without them, but food options would become limited if they went away. And bees do more than give humans something to snack on. They help keep ecosystems biologically diverse.
And so they have an integral role in keeping these ecosystems functioning just because they are such a critical component of the floral reproductive cycle.
Michael Engel again.
As time goes on, they are helping those lineages persist, and as populations get fragmented and whatnot, they help them diversify and keep going. So if you remove them from that ecosystem, a large component of the pollination services would shut down, and those floras would literally wither.
A loss of bees and other pollinators could cause some flowers to go extinct. So what are the current stressors bees face today? Dave Golson is a professor at the University of Sussex in London. He's always had an interest in insects as a child and got his PhD on butterflies. He now focuses on the bumblebee. Golson says wild pollinators get overlooked.
You often hear people talking about the bee when they really mean honeybees and giving the impression that honeybees pollinate everything. But of course, there's a lot more to it than that. The evidence suggests that wild pollinators deliver more crop pollination than honeybees do. For example, in the UK, we know that for the crops that we grow in the UK that need insect pollination, honeybees deliver a maximum of 30% of that. So at least 70% is being delivered by wild bees.
And other animals pollinate too. They could be bats or moths. Another pollinator is a chocolate midge.
The cacao tree that produces the beans that we make chocolate from is pollinated by a tiny fly. Bees are absolutely useless for pollinating cacao, so we wouldn't have chocolate if we didn't have these little midges, little tiny flies that pollinate that particular crop.
Scientists know that wild bees are declining. Some species have disappeared from their usual habitats, and others have nearly gone extinct. Some examples include the rusty patch bumblebee and the Franklin's bumblebee.
The reality is, most bee species, we have no good data on their population trends. Outside of North America and Europe, we don't really have any data at all on how pollinators are doing. And even in North America and Europe, we mostly just have maps. So we can look at the distributions, and if a bee disappears from part of its distribution, we can see that that's happened. But we don't know how the actual numbers are changing.
Golson says these numbers are hard to get because bees move from place to place, so large gaps of information exist. But the evidence on hand shows a decline in bees. The trend has gone on for the past 50 years or longer.
One of the biggest drivers is the way farming has changed in that period. It's become much more mechanized, fields have become much bigger. Farming has become, if you like, homogenized. Instead of a patchwork of different crops on quite a small scale, usually interspersed with livestock farming.
Farmers have started using more fertilizers and pesticides, and these shifts have allowed farmers to grow large amounts of wheat and corn.
But in doing so, they're creating a landscape that is pretty inhospitable to anything other than the crop. If you're a bee, a field of wheat offers you absolutely nothing. Associated with that, we've also contaminated some of the areas that aren't farmed, that are near farmed land.
That contamination usually comes from insecticides and pesticides, but even that is hard to study.
What we do know is that Honeybees are exposed to lots of pesticides, some of which are insecticides and are toxic to bees at low doses. We know from looking at the food that bees collect, both honeybee, honey and pollen stores, and also the same in bumblebees, that their food is contaminated with complicated mixtures of pesticides. And that's really hard to study because generally speaking, all of the toxicological studies that are done tend to look at one chemical at a time, and it's really difficult to understand the effects of exposing bees to complicated mixtures and mixtures that are different in every place and in every year.
What is clear is that certain amounts of some pesticides do negatively affect bees' behavior and ability to lay eggs, and bees seem to have the most problems in places that have a lot of pesticide use. Diseases also add to the stresses bees face. Humans have domesticated honeybees over the years and taken them around the world, but moving them to new areas has exposed them to diseases they can't fight off, and diseases from domesticated honeybees have spilled over into wild bees.
Most of the bee diseases that we know of are not host specific. They don't just infect one species. And that's part of the problem. So, for example, we recently discovered an Asian gut parasite of bees. It came from the Asian honeybee. The parasite is called Nosema cerani. It's actually a fungus that lives in the guts of bees and causes kind of bee diarrhea. We recently discovered that that's been accidentally brought to Europe and to North America.
Golson says this disease has shown up in wild bumblebees in Britain. They now struggle to cope with a disease that did not affect them 20 years ago.
On top of that, climate change is starting to kick in, which is particularly harmful for bumblebees because they prefer cold weather. And there's clear evidence that the southern edges of bumblebee ranges are starting to edge northwards as a result of climate change. So it's this whole kind of combination of factors acting together, and bees might be able to cope with one or two of them, but if you simultaneously throw all these different things at them, then it's not really surprising that they're declining.
The problems bees face are many, but solutions exist. We'll see what they are in part 4. I'm Kofi Styles, and you're listening to Life Interlinked. We've covered the different issues facing wild and managed bees. The causes are complicated, and the solutions are not simple, but something can still be done to help. Golson says wild bees need more monitoring.
Persuading anyone to set up a long-term monitoring program is difficult. No funders want to fund something which won't really be useful for at least 10 years and will be most use after 20 or 30 years. But you really need to look long term. It's such a shame that 30 years ago someone didn't start monitoring pollinators, because if they had done, we would know exactly what's happening. The next best thing is to start now, and then at least people 30 years from now will have the answers.
Surveying every pollinator is hard because so many exist.
But even if we could get a monitoring scheme just for bees, say, that would be a massive step in the right direction. It could be done, but somebody needs to pay for it.
Habitat loss has taken away many food sources from bees. Michael Engel says gardening may help as well.
Planting for your particular region native wildflower gardens. Those are resources that your native bees in those areas will respond to and like.
Engel says the habitats around that garden should also make it easy for bees to nest. He also says people should take more political action to make sure bees get more protection.
There are a lot of decisions that are being made in this world that are negatively impacting our pollinators. And those decisions are being made at local, state, and federal levels in many countries. A famous one, of course, is the Paris Accords. With pulling out of that, it does represent a hindrance to some of these efforts to conserve pollinators. And so I think people need to be more mindful, and speak with their vote.
Thomas Seeley of Cornell University offered a possible solution for dealing with varroa mites. Seeley studies the behavior of wild honeybees to see what beekeepers can learn from their survival success. One group of wild honeybees that he studies lives in Cornell University's Arnott Research Forest.
What makes them special is that there are not beekeepers nearby the forest, and so natural selection has been allowed to operate on those bees to develop bees or select for bees that have resistance to the varroa mite. Nobody's treating those bees. They're living all on their own up in trees, so it's sink or swim for those colonies. And many sank, but some swam.
Seeley has learned that honeybees can live without being treated for varroa mites. Scientists have known that bees have their own ways of dealing with mites in their hives.
One is to just chew up the adult mites when they're walking around on the bees. But another technique that they have, which is equally powerful, is that they prevent adult mites from reproducing. The mites reproduce in the brood cells of the bees. These bees have the ability to detect which cells are infested with a varroa mite, a female varroa mite that's reproducing in the cell, and they open up the cell and pull out the pupa and pull out the mite and the developing mites, and that ends that cycle of reproduction for that mite.
The colonies in the wild have smaller nests. Having smaller hives prevents the mites from having enough bee larvae to eat. But Seeley says the way beekeepers manage their colonies ends up helping varroa mites.
The colonies kept by beekeepers are constantly being treated for the mites, and they don't allow selection to operate. What we're learning in the wild is there's enough variation in the wild among the bees so that if you let selection operate, resistant bees will develop.
The reason is that mites evolved resistance to the pesticides used to kill them, but honeybee colonies can evolve resistance to the mites. Researchers in Germany have used mite-resistant bees on Gotland Island off the coast of Sweden as a model for bee breeding.
Another example is in Wales. The beekeepers got together there and said, well, most of us are going to stop treating, and now they don't have to treat for the mites. There's a beekeeper in France, well-known John Keefus, that stopped treating, and he challenges people to even find mites in his bees now, and it's hard.
And East African colonies have lower losses from mites too. Many Kenyan beekeepers run family-owned backyard colonies. They traditionally leave their hives alone and don't treat them. Their colonies have likely gone through strong natural selection. But downsides to letting evolution take place exist. Seeley says a short-term disaster would likely take place if the Darwinian approach became standard. Genetic evidence from the Arnott Forest bees show that a large number of bees died off when the mite came to the U.S.
I would estimate that probably only 10% of the colonies survived, but from that 10%, the population has regrown.
The same die-off happened in the Gotland bees.
Population goes through a bottleneck that then rebuilds from resistant strains.
Seeley says countryside beekeepers would benefit most from the practice, but many beekeepers in the same area would need to manage their colonies in the same way for Seeley's approach to work. That's because the one hive of untreated bees would likely mix in with the treated bees. That mixture would throw off the selective process.
You really have to have a population of bees that are experiencing natural selection for progress to be made.
Beekeepers and scientists continue to study the issue of bee decline and colony loss. Better monitoring and gardening may help ease the problems bees face, but solving bigger issues like climate change and environmental collapse will need attention too. And breeding programs that mimic natural selection could help make healthy bees. None of these options are a silver bullet, but they are doable. And that's the show. Watch out for next week as we delve into the intelligence of slime molds. I'm Kofi Styles, and this has been Life Interlinked.